Welcome to the Demonstrating Implementation Excellence stream of SNOMED CT Expo 2024. Thank you to FAST for sponsoring this stream. My name is Nikki Ingram and I'm a senior terminologist at SNOMED International. I will be moderating today's session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Online attendees, please use the Q&A button to type your questions to the presenter. On-site attendees, please use the microphone provided in the room. I'm now pleased to introduce Matthew Cordell from CSIRO, who will be presenting Impacts of Model Changes on Implementations, Change Management and Lessons Learned in Updating the Australian Medicines Terminology. Matt, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm recording this from Brisbane, Australia, on the lands of the Yugara and the Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Matt Cordell, Principal Terminologist at CSIRO and the Australian NRC. Today I'm going to be giving you an insight into our experience introducing a substantial change to the Australian edition of SNOMED CT and its impact on the implementer community and how we help them navigate those changes. Although the changes I'm talking about today were based on the medicines terminology, the lessons learned are applicable to terminology changes in any of the content areas. So we've been publishing Australian medicines terminology for 10 years now, and although it is very SNOMED-like, it's published in an RF2 format and it has very same structures, it is its own, has been its own thing, and it's sitting in its own module separate from the rest of SNOMED. It has its own substances, units of measure, dose forms, all those things, completely isolated from the rest of the terminology. So that was one of the main drivers for V4, was to bring in that close integration with core and use that content that already exists within SNOMED. In doing so, we thought we'll take this opportunity as well to make some improvements to the model, because it's been in use for 10 years. We've sort of learned what does work and what doesn't work. And in this 2-year process to update the model, we've had regular stakeholder meetings, and that's involved 33 different organisations to those regular meetings, but also we've had an active support desk. It's had one-on-one meetings with different vendors as they've required. And so in these meetings and this consultation period, it's given us an opportunity to demonstrate the model and the opportunities that we think improvements could make, and also getting feedback from the vendors of the impacts it would make to them, but also what they would like to see change. Because we've had a number of years of use, and vendors have fed back of improvements they would like to see, things that don't work for them, and so on. And so that brings us through to the kind of changes that we've implemented. And so now I'd like to just give you an insight into some of the changes that we did introduce with V4. So I've said there were model changes. That was obviously, we're changing the model, so there's going to be new attributes, retired attributes, replacement attributes, but also some description changes and concept retirements and replacements, which those in particular are very common between every edition of SNOMED, both international and within NRCs. We also had changes to our bundle structure because we're also changing our tooling process. So we're adopting SNOMED International's managed service, as well as building some other tooling to help integrate with that to produce our releases. And so all these things come together that required a few changes to our bundling to align with what's currently done internationally, because we've been publishing AMTv3 in the RF2 format since it was first conceived. And since then, a few things have been sort of solidified because the specification itself is a bit open to interpretation. And now I'd just like to give you a bit of an insight in some of the description changes. Start with one of the main changes is probably some of our semantic tags. Most of those are all updated, except for medicinal product, because that already existed. But all of our qualifier values like substances, dose forms, things like that that moved across, they took up the semantic tag of the hierarchy that we moved those into, because our goal to minimize impact here was to not retire concepts if we were going to just recreate the same thing there. So we moved AMT concepts into the hierarchy. We did have some more specific FSNs, and this was really for the medicinal product concepts, where we changed our FSNs to reflect the convention that's currently within SNOMED now, where we'll say products containing or products containing only. Another one was the punctuation within terms. AMT's traditionally used a lowercase format, and we've introduced sentence case for all those terms. So that's simply just uppercasing the first letter of most of the terms, unless it was clinically significant, to be lowercase. And another unusual change was language preferences. Since RF2 was introduced, we've only ever provided a preferred synonym, and that's the preferred term. But now we're introducing a preferred FSN and a preferred text definition, because this keeps us in line with what the managed service delivers as part of its release bundle. And so that was really the only reason to do that. But again, that's another change. Now I'll just give you a couple of small examples of the kinds of changes that I'm talking about here. So on the left, we've got a medicinal product. In V3 on the first row, these terms, you can see this first product, a Synopivir medicinal product. When we had our V4 version, the term has stayed the same, the preferred term, but it's got that capital A at the start. And our FSN has been expanded to say that it's product containing a Synopivir. Our medicinal product unit of use from V3, that's equivalent to a clinical drug essentially within the SNOMED terminology. So we've adopted that semantic tag, and the rest of the term we've left unchanged because we do have some slightly different editorial rules there, but we have taken on the capital P for paracetamol at the start there. And so for modelling changes, this is really where the rubber hits the road, where most of the impact is felt as both an author and an implementer if you're using these relationships. The modelling changes included replacing attributes. So this is where an Australian attribute is being replaced by an equivalent sort of thing from SNOMED. Replacing targets, so the range of those attributes. So before we were referencing Australian substances, we'll now be referencing SNOMED substances. Introducing new attributes to address modelling that did not previously exist, and retiring and replacing concepts. Mostly, as I said, we tried to only retire concepts if they were duplicated by international content, and this was really for our substances, forms, and units of measure, those qualifier values. The big impact on our drug model was the medicinal products, where about 60% of our medicinal products already existed within SNOMED, so that was the biggest impact. Retiring those concepts and using the international counterpart. And so you can see here, these are the kind of examples of what our retired AU concept was and what the replacement core concept. And we sort of had multiple reviews to check that these were equivalent replacements. And now I'll just give you some specific examples from within the terminology of how concepts change between the two. So here we've got our what was medicinal product unit of use, or now a clinical drug. On the left you can see it's V3 modelling, and on the right our V4 modelling. This is retained the same concept ID, but essentially you can see, I think, everything within this concept has been replaced within its definition. Both the parent concept, the attributes have all been replaced, all the targets for those have been replaced, and the dose form, even the attribute has the same name, but we've replaced it with the international counterpart and the dose form. Similarly with this example for gentamicin, the same things happened here, where the model is a little bit different on the right for V4 because this is a slightly different product. It's a contained ampule of medicine, so it's got a few more properties, but we can see that we've kept the same concept ID. The preferred term is essentially the same except for that capital G at the start, but all the other attributes have been replaced by their SNOMED counterparts or new V4 attributes that we've created for this model. And now, I won't go into these in too much detail because the release bundle isn't the most exciting topic, but the concrete domains, we've changed to use the new concrete domain format. AMT V3 had adopted a previous draft format for concrete domains, and that had been in use for years successfully, but in aligning with the new standards, we've adopted that. That's probably the biggest change, but then also merging our reference sets. All of our simple ref sets are now merged into a single file. Historically, we've published a separate file for each reference set, and the file was named according to the preferred term of the reference set. That itself has historically caused us issues where if we wanted to change the name of a reference set, the name of the file changed, and there's all sorts of complications with that. So there's other reasons too about simplicity of importing files, and the inclusion of core ref sets previously excluded. This is sort of an additive change. Historically, we haven't included reference sets from the international release that weren't applicable to Australia. So things like ICD-9, we just excluded those and didn't make those available to the public, unless they specifically asked for them for whatever reason it might be. And then no more Delta. So the Delta subdirectory or Delta version of a release bundle is no longer produced by SNOMED International. So we're aligning with that effort and encouraging our users who do want to use a Delta to use the Delta creation tool that's published by SNOMED International. So now I've given you a look at the kind of changes that were involved in our migration to this new drug model. I'll start with part one of our change management process. So we've done the obvious things to start with. We created update specifications, updated editorial guide, implementation guidance, sample code. We provide a variety of sample code to help implementers learn how to use the terminology, and parallel beta releases. So we produced a parallel release of our SNOMED edition with the model changes applied. So at any point, if you thought for this release, what would it look like in the new format, you could look at that. That was published as an RF2 bundle, exactly how users would use it, with the intent that at any point when implementers wanted to do some beta testing, they can take that bundle, put it in their product and see what impacts it would have, do some digging around and see what they needed to change and all those sort of things, and gave us that big window of opportunity to work out what they needed to do, what issues we might have had with our transform to produce this other model, all those sort of things. However, implementers are not terminology experts. They've got a lot going on. Like for those of us that live in the terminology space, and it's 90% of our day job, for implementers, it's maybe 5% of their day job. Terminology is just a small element for implementers. They've got other things to deal with. They've got their customers to work with, their clinical functionality that their tool's supposed to do, business requirements, reporting requirements, government obligations, all those sort of things they're dealing with. Really, I think for implementers, they want terminology to just do what they want it to do and not have to think about it. Once they've implemented it, they tend not to revisit it unless they need to do something different. They'll just take the monthly releases and import them and hope it all works as it should. So that means a lot of what we produced, the feedback we got was, this is all really great documentation of what you're doing, but they haven't got time to process all that and then do a whole impact analysis for their organization. So we had to sort of rethink of what we could do to help them, because we'd explained everything and we published a lot of things, but helping them take on this change needed a little bit more work. And this brings us to understanding our implementers. Now, you've probably heard something similar to this before, but it applies just as much here as it does anywhere else, that if you've worked with one implementation of SNOMED, you understand one implementation of SNOMED. As I said, we work with 33 different stakeholders for this project, and each of them had their own approach to adopting terminology, from startups to multinationals, either for technical requirements or business requirements. They all use the terminology in a different way for whatever purpose that they felt the terminology was going to deliver for their system. And so to help us guide them through this process, we thought, or to understand what we needed to do to help them, we sort of built some profiles of what types of implementers there were. And so now I'd like to talk you through those profiles. We started with understanding how the terminology is consumed. So how do they get the terminology into their system? And we've narrowed it down to there's three approaches, at least within Australia for this third one. You've got obviously an RF2 import, and this is where they take that zip file of your release and they import it into their database. They might do a bit of pre-processing and take out what they do or don't want, but that's the essential workflow. Within Australia, we're really trying to encourage the adoption of FHIR terminology services. And so we've got Onto Server that we publish as a binary index. They can take that, import it into their instance of the server, and they interact with the terminology through FHIR APIs. And then finally, we've got this thing called the AMT flat file, which has been available for a number of years as an experimental artifact. and it's essentially just an adjacency table. It's a single text file delimited with tabs, and it provides a relationship between each of the concept classes within the medicines terminology, from the least specific medicinal product all the way through a branded contained product. And I'll give you some examples of that later on, but that was sort of an artifact we developed many years ago to sort of help people adopt SNOMED. So there are 3 ways of how they're consuming terminology into their system. So I've looked at how they're consuming the terminology, and the next step is how are they using the terminology? And there's really 2 coins here that kind of work together of what they're doing. Are they using SNOMED on the interface as a native implementation, or are they mapping it in the back end and to their local codes? And so the SNOMED terms don't actually appear, that they're doing a mapping process from what their interface looks like to SNOMED in the back end. And that's particularly common with legacy systems where they can't overhaul the front end to look like SNOMED, or where the front end is very susceptible to formatting changes. And then the other coin is, how are they using SNOMED? Are they just recording concept IDs for recording or exchanging? Or are they actually leveraging the ontology relationships? So to know the causative agent of this allergy is this substance, and the ingredient of this product is this other substance, or all those sort of things. What are they doing with the terminology? They're either using concept IDs or they're doing something a bit more advanced. And it really depends on the maturity of the implementation. So taking these factors into account, we can come up with the implementation maturity pyramid, inverted in this case. But if we start at the top, we've got our interoperability level, where it's used universally, or the concept IDs are adopted as a mechanism for transferring information from one point to another, or recording it in a standard way. The next level down is when our vendors tend to split to 2 different camps. We have those that are mapping to their legacy local codes and just using SNOMED in the back end for, again, interoperability, but they're not changing their front end. And then we've got native implementations that are either having a bespoke database with SNOMED exposed to the user, or they're using FHIR terminology services. The next level down, we get a bit more advanced, where we're doing a bit more than interoperability. And this is where the vendors are using at least the ISA relationships, which are typically about subsumption and trying to group things. Even secondary analytics, where we're just trying to group categories of codes into things, they can take a lot of advantage of these ISA relationships within the ontology. And then our final level of maturity is when the vendors are actually using the attributes within the model. And these are for more advanced queries, perhaps working out what substance causes a particular allergy and relating that to the ingredient that is within a product, and patterns like that. And this brings us to part 2 of change management. What can we do to help users now that we have an understanding of how they're using the terminology, how they're importing it, what they're doing with it, and what we've come up with, I guess, is best viewed as like a field guide. It's something they can get and say, all right, I've got this, what do I need to look at that applies to me and my place in this implementation ecosystem? So the first thing that we developed as part of this new guidance was this matrix that starts off with an enumeration of all the changes that we've made between going from V3 to V4, and then provide an indication for each of these types of users of whether it's something that might impact them, and then finally where they can find some further guidance on it. So the goal for this was that a user can come along and they goes, all right, I'm using the flat file, what do I need to be worried about? And they can see that it's concept IDs and term changes. If they're using the RF2, there's a few more things they need to be worried about. They might not all impact them, but this is the sections of the document they need to read. So rather than having to read the whole document and then decipher what applies to them or what doesn't, a user can self-identify. We've got some guidance at the start of the document that helps them work out what sort of implementer they are. And then we direct them straight to a brief section that tells them that what that change is. They can evaluate whether that applies to them. And if so, they can go out and look at the specification for more detail still. So we've tried to shortcut that so they don't have to read all the specifications. A user can come along, work out where they sit, what they probably do need to pay attention to, and then go straight there. I mentioned the flat file earlier, and as I said, it's just a flat file. It's a single pre-computed table. So we also provide the code for users to generate this themselves, but we provide it as a flat file, and you can see they can look up any one of these concept classes. I haven't provided the full thing. This is a convenient cut down version. And you can see it's not normalized. We've got cetirizine in multiple rows, but they can look it up and say, what sort of medicinal product is Zyrtec 10 milligram tablets? And they can quickly look the other side of that table and get that field. It's a very easy lookup process. And so each row is showing all the concepts related to a specific branded container product. And that's our most specific thing that we have within AMT. And then for relationship impacts, we had to get a bit more technical, and we provided some example queries for both SQL and ECL to show users the kind of things that might change. So we identified a range of different types of queries that you might be performing on the terminology, and provided both a V3 version and what that might look like in V4 so that they can see what changes. So on the left here, I've got an example where I'm just querying the destination concepts of a particular ID. And I've showed that from the V3 and the V4 version, the only change is that the type ID has changed. We've replaced, and this particular one has an intended active ingredient. It's now could be an intended ingredient or precise ingredient. And they can look at these queries and say, well, I'm performing similar sorts of things, maybe not this exact query, but this is the kind of thing that my system does. We should go and look at that and see how our queries are impacted by these changes. And depending on the queries, there might be little things like the SQL query where it's just the type ID changes, whereas the ECL, when you've got destination concepts involved as well that are retired, so our substances, dose forms, and units of measure that I mentioned, most of that query is overhauled, and the only thing that stays the same is our focus reference set at the start of that query. And so how about those in the community that are adopting SNOMED through a mapping? Now, I'm going to say that the impact for those for this particular process was low because we tried to retain the concepts wherever possible. We only retired concepts if they were being moved and duplicated existing content, really. And that applied to all of our qualifiers, which most users weren't mapping to, but it did have a big impact on our medicinal products. The other thing that was surprising was the actual change in terms does affect automatic mappings, because they do check each release, and if the term changes, they sort of have assumed that something must have changed they need to intervene on. So our atenolol with capital A is different to atenolol with a lowercase a. We went through and reassured them that when we've done these changes, if the ID is the same, we meant the same thing, the mappings do not need to update. But as I said, the medicinal product class was heavily impacted. So about 60% of that content already existed within SNOMED. So we've replaced that with historical associations, as is done in normal terminology maintenance. But there was limited awareness in the community that those things existed to help them work out that our mappings can be replaced by this. So but this process was good in increasing the awareness that that thing has always existed, but no one was really using it to check their mappings. Whenever they found a retired concept, it was quite often a manual process to go through a browser and work out what the replacement might be or their mapping tool. So although they had the lower impact, they still had their own sets of impacts and challenges with this migration. And so here we are, we're at the end. Our go live was last month. It was supposed to be June, but it got postponed because feedback from the stakeholders they weren't ready at that time. As I said, they've got other things, competing requirements coming in. So we moved that out to September. As we approached our go live date, more support was required near the end, as late as August. A lot of vendors, I don't think, really looked at the beta releases in anger until it came time to actually do something about it. But we did get a lot of support queries through, and as vendors encountered issues, we gave them direct, specific help with their problems. That included reviewing some of their code, reviewing their queries, answering questions when they said their system wasn't working the way they thought it would. Some of those things required us to make changes to the terminology. We had to add in some relationships, things like that. So again, it was a two-way thing. Those betas also provided us an opportunity to work out where things might have broken in their transform process. And so since launch, we've had a small number of support requests since, but mostly I think it's been so far so good. And those support queries that have come in, I don't think there's been anything that we weren't expecting. So we haven't had any surprises so far, no major breaks. And so thank you for sticking out through this talk. If you've got any other questions, my colleagues Sarah and Dion are here today, so they've worked closely within this project, and if you want to approach them at the SORO booth, I'm sure they'll be able to answer any other questions you have. But now I'm happy to switch over to the live Q&A, and I'll see you online. Thank you again.
Thank you, Matt. Matt will now join us from Australia to take questions. As a reminder, if you're in the room, please use the microphone to ask your question. Are there any questions in the room? Hi, Matt. If there aren't any, I've got a couple here. What level of advance notice do you think vendors would be happy with?
As much as you can give them. We like I said, for this process, we did it over nearly 18 months or so. We probably gave them 12 months notice, and that's pretty generous, I think, but a lot of them still would like more. They've got their roadmaps that might be out for a couple of years. So I feel like 12 months for something this substantial is probably a minimum that people might expect, unfortunately.
Okay. And another question might be, what are the two biggest obstacles to change management with implementers?
I think just having them allocate the time to look at what the changes are for them. A lot of them saw a lot of changes and thought this is going to have major impacts, but I think most of the vendors, once they got into it, realized that it didn't impact them personally as much, especially our approach of keeping concept IDs where we could. That saved a lot of them effort, because most of them really just had that in their systems, and as long as that wasn't changing, they didn't have a lot to worry about.
Okay, so are there any more questions in the room? Yeah, there is one question at the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I want to ask, when you switch from AMT3 to AMT4, you have a period of running in parallel, or you completely cut off?
No, it was a complete cutoff. So that this month we did the parallel previews, but the history within each of those previews didn't persist. So each preview was a standoff transform. And a lot of that was just because we couldn't do them in parallel because there was a bit of loss between the two. So once we switched over, that was it. So that's why we sort of gave a lot of this 12 months notice and made sure everyone was ready for that switch over.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. If there aren't any more questions, with that, we will conclude this session. Online delegates, you can stay here for the next presentation in this stream or access another session through the event lobby.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.